Hello and welcome to the C programming lecture on switch statements. What is a switch statement? A switch statement is similar to an if statement. It allows for a selection to occur based on a case. However, those cases do not necessarily allow things like Boolean expressions. So instead, you're switching off something like a numeric. So let's go ahead and just quickly break down what a switch statement looks like. So we can see here that we have a keyword switch. So this is the switch statement. We have some type of numerical expression, and then we have individual cases as well as a default. So this case statement will typically be followed by some value here. So it would say case and then some value and with colons, also having break statements underneath. So that way it doesn't fall through to the next case. So in this programming language, in C, the case statements need to have an explicit break or something to indicate that this is completed in order for the next case not to be executed. So by default, if I did not have this here, it would actually fall through to this default case and run it as well. And we'll see that in an example of in our coding that we'll go over. So again, switch statement is the keyword, case, default, and we have some braces here. And recall that we have the ability to create scopes, so we could even have curly braces in between our cases and defaults, which is a habit that I usually use. So here's a brief example of a case statement. And what we can see here is this is actually an example of a fall through. So you can see that I have a variable called grade. Grade is set to the value 80. And now we switch off of that value. And you can see here that it actually goes to the case labeled with the value 80. And we do not have a break statement like our 90. And we can actually see in our output that it falls through to the next case. And this is because we don't have a break. Now, if we had a break here, it would just print this out and then continue on. So this was just an example of how the fall through works as well. But again, we'll just mess around with it a bit so that way you can get a clearer understanding of what it does. So again, a brief review of what a switch statement is. A switch statement is just another way for you to express a selection in a different way. You can usually rewrite switch statements using if statements, or sometimes vice versa. So the switch statement is made up of numerical input expressions followed by constraints and values of the same input for the case statements. Break statements also allow the case statements to not fall through. There's also an optional default statement which will execute whether none of those conditions in your cases are usually are not available. So in lower level code, this type of expression can be referred to as something called a jump table or a branch table. All right, welcome to our coding session regarding the switch statement. So let's go ahead and get started using our usual setup here. So I'm going to go ahead and write the hello world program that we typically write just to get things started, make sure everything's working, everything's compiling. And, this is just a good habit for you to get into, especially when you're first starting out. All right, there we go. So we know everything's running. Let's go ahead and just kind of run with the example that we previously had. Let's just make a variable called g. We'll give it this time 90. Let's make our switch statement similar to the example that we had inside the lecture. So we're going to switch off our variable g. We'll have a case statement for, let's say 90. I like to put my stuff inside of a scope brace like this. So I'm just going to go ahead and do it this way. I'm going to format it the way that I like to do it. So we'll say 80. And again, we will not have a break statement here. So we can say default, like so. Add some braces, make a break statement, and let's just add some output here. A, just some grade letters or something. B, and we'll say this is just default case, something like that. And actually, let's get rid of this break here, and let's compile our program, run it, and we can see that it gives us a. So let's go ahead and add some new lines, and this should all be making some sense to you. Now, what would happen if I did a reassignment here? So if I did something like a equals 70, for instance. Now, do you think anything will be affected? Let's see. So make sure we save this. GCC may not see. So you can see that actually we need to reassign this. GCC may not see. We can see that nothing is affected really because the condition is actually evaluated at the top. So if we were to go back up to our line 5 and rerun this before executing this line, we would actually get the default case. And we can see that by like just imagining that, you know, it came back up here and reassigned this. And see, that out, and we get our default case, and we actually forgot a new line here as well. So let's go ahead and make this 80 so that way we can see an example of a fall through. So GCC may not see, get that out, and this again is an example of a fall through, and the reason why is because there's no break statement, right? So for instance, if I had a break here and I recompiled the program and ran it, you can see that it just breaks at this point and it does not continue on to our default case. So if you want it to fall through, which sometimes you do, then you would just leave this break statement out. Now you may be asking yourself, why is it that I use these this scope braces? This is not necessary. You don't need those. It's just something that I like to do because let's for instance say that you have an int x, you know, let's say 100 or something, and let's say that you have another int x here but it's not equal to some value, and then the default case doesn't have an x, like a different variable name or something along those lines. It's just a way to ensure that the scope that you're declaring certain variables don't leak outside of this statement. So you may only want a variable to last its lifetime to last the scope of the switch statement, if that makes sense. So this is a good way to make sure that you don't have to declare it outside of here because you may not need it or something. It's really just a way for me to personally organize my code. Again, this is the exact same thing as doing something like this. There's the only difference being that if you declare a variable within that, the scope is not leaked elsewhere. So I'll provide an example here in a second. So GCC may not see, get it out, you can see. Let's get rid of this break statement. Let's make a x variable. Let's call it 1. Let's print x. Let's see what happens here. And then we're going to print x again. So yeah, like we actually cannot declare it within the switch statement. So what we would have to do is pull this guy out, create a scope, like we did before. See, undeclared x. So interesting, it doesn't actually let us define this at all. So this is something I learned as well. So it's saying that you cannot define, or this x variable is undeclared, but we declare it up here. Well, actually it's yelling at this line. So even if we took these out, for instance, it looks like the same error, a different error is actually given. So we have actually two different errors here. So we can't actually, I'll go ahead and make this compiled so we clear the error here. So we can't compile this. And the reason is the compiler is saying a label can only be part of a statement and declaration is not a statement. So technically we can't do this. It's not okay. We'd have to pull this out and then make it globally, available to the switch statement. So now we have the ability to access and manipulate X, but that is not necessarily what we wanted. So if we go back a few steps here, we go ahead and remove this line and we run. We see that this actually works, and the reason why this works is because we have the scope and we can define variables inside of the scope. Now things do start to get a little weird because you can probably start executing stuff before this and then have a scope, and then just all kinds of weird stuff can happen. So again, these are, you learn some of this stuff by just messing around with some of the code. And like I said, I learned just now that defining this variable outside of, because I've been setting this up for this way so long, defining this outside of these braces is actually not allowed, which makes sense. So the question is whether or not we can still access this outside of the scope. Now I'm going to go ahead and go on a limb here and say that this is not going to compile, and yeah, it's not, because this is within a scope. Even if we took this break statement out like this, it should still complain. Again, we'd have to make it globally available. So these are weird cases. I just wanted to expose you to them. Mess around with some of this stuff that you learn to get better insight into how it works. It's always best to try something that you're thinking about first before just implementing a code and making sure it works the way you expect it to. So I hope this video was insightful. I hope we learned something new today about switch statements and how to set them up. If you like the way that I set them up, just carry on doing it this way. This is what I enjoy doing for several different reasons. But yeah, thanks for watching. See you in the next lecture.